not in comparison to the contraction. And of course, Latin America and the Caribbean will also have a severe contraction this year because of their links to the United States. I think the right-hand side is very interesting indeed. Look at the emerging and developing Asia I've just mentioned. 1% growth this year is predicted by the IMF, even with the worst crises since perhaps the Great Depression. But next year, emerging and developing Asia is expected to grow very quickly as the world economy recovers. So I think there's a great opportunity here for a number of countries to take advantage of this and to perhaps have a boom year. I know by standards in India, 8.5% is not well, it is a boom, but you're more used to 6 or 7% growth for the last few years. So you may have a better time next year. Unfortunately, it's because of a crisis and a rebound effect. Now, in terms of the outlook, a number of points to make. So I've just made this point. We're expected to see a global recession this year. That is not a surprise. And it'll be more severe than we saw after the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. So this will be the biggest recession for probably 70 or 80 years, and maybe even longer than that, unfortunately. But the rebound, we have to keep that in mind. I'm not saying this is guaranteed. I'm saying it is absolutely, the potential is there, but it depends on governments to do the right thing. I want to come back to that, of course. As I say, more rapid recovery, however, than after. So it's a deeper recession than we had in the global financial crisis, but a more rapid recovery. Now, the key point that I'm making here is potentially with no scarring effect. What I mean by scarring effect is this. After the global financial crisis, long-term growth rates in many developed economies actually slowed down. There was a scarring effect in that it took us 10 years to rebuild, to restructure economies, to refinance our financial markets. And that was ongoing. I think this time it's more likely we will get a sharp rebound without any long-term permanent damage. But I know that will not be agreed by everybody. That's simply a viewpoint which perhaps we need to discuss later. And of course, there's no question that the speed of recovery and the scale of recovery absolutely depends on the speed with which the pandemic itself recedes. And that in turn will depend on government policy across the world. And we're all in this together, obviously. Now, just to give you a very brief overview, the IMF is only one organization producing one set of forecasts. They are not the only ones. What is remarkable as I'm looking at all of the analysis out there at the moment is the range of forecasts is quite incredible. The most pessimistic is similar to the IMF, so 6%. But the most optimistic forecast from some organizations is growth this year of 0.5%. I dismiss that. I do not expect that to happen at all. The average is a 1.2% contraction, but you know, I always say to my students, be wary of the definition of average. Average is your hands in the fridge and the backside in the oven. It's not very helpful, actually, when it comes to economic forecasts. Could you all turn off your microphones, please? I can hear a lot of noise in somebody's room. Please turn off your microphones. It'd be very helpful. Just to help all of us. Hello, that's it. Thank you so much. That's very helpful. Somebody's microphone is still on. If you can turn your microphones off, please. Please.
Professor Joe.
Yep.
Yeah, but I'm just interrupting for a minute. Professor Joe, can you just allow the several participants are still waiting?
Of course. I didn't realize that. Thank you.
If you kindly.
I'll admit all. I've admitted all again. There you are.
Okay.
Okay.
And in the meantime, I also, on behalf of iLEAD, I'm also welcoming our chairman, sir, Mr. Pradeep Chopra. He is also present here. So, sir, thank you for be here.
Good afternoon, all of you. Nice hearing Niels. Now let's hear the others.
Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here and an honor. Thank you for that. The last point on this slide, and I don't have very many slides, by the way, we're going to have a discussion very soon, but just as a comparison. So here we have the IMF predicting this year a fall of maybe 3% in the world economy. Most pessimistic forecasters, they think it'll be 6%. Some optimists around, I don't think they're going to be right. But during the global financial crisis, the world economy only contracted by 0.7%. So there's no question that this crisis today is the worst contraction we're going to ever see. Well, we've ever seen for several generations, and perhaps it may be the worst in living memory. So it's really quite something to say that. So recovery, what's going to look like? Well, first of all, we've got to take the first steps. We've really got to work very hard to restore confidence, consumer confidence, business confidence. Of course, around the world, many governments are now implementing tracing, testing, and isolation. I'm still getting feedback. If everybody can turn their microphones off, it would be appreciated. I'm just trying to give you the best possible sound. Of course, we also need to see the rolling back of social distancing when ready. We're hoping to start that in the UK very soon. I don't know exactly when. They're doing it already in a number of countries around the world, but that has to continue, of course. And then at some stage in the future, and I'm no scientist, we are going to need a vaccination for confidence to really be restored. I find it difficult to imagine people wanting to go on an airplane unless there's a vaccination or a vaccine available to everybody. So this is going to take a long time. And then the big question is, when will business return to normal, and in what form? Just as we are having a Zoom session today, I think many sectors, the new normal will look very different to what it was like in the past. Education has gone online, and perhaps much of it will remain online. A lot of business has gone online, retailing, and perhaps that will continue as well. So what will business as usual look like for each of us around the world in our different countries and our different sectors? Now, you may not have come across this terminology, but there's a lot of discussion in the media recently about what shape will recovery take. And it used to be called the alphabet shapes. It's literally a series of letters. A V-shaped recovery is described as a very sharp fall with a very quick recovery. Clearly, that's what we all hope for, a speedy recovery, down and then up next year. And for some economies, that will be true. For many sectors, that will be true. But I don't think it'll be true for everybody. But I'm just hoping it's true for all of us, if possible. The U-shaped, of course, is not such good news. It's a more prolonged downturn, and it will take somewhat more time to return to previous level. But nevertheless, it does give hope for the future. Then, of course, there's the famous double dip. And I think this is very possible and indeed very likely, perhaps. It's where we go down and we go back up. So there's the V. But what if we get a second surge of the virus and then another lockdown? We could face another drop followed by another recovery. And this is what governments are really trying to avoid. They would rather have a recovery that was sustainable, but I'm not sure if it's possible. I almost don't want to talk about the L-shaped recovery. I often say L means hell. It's where you go down and you perhaps decline for a long time and perhaps reach a new normal. An example of this would have been the Great Depression of the 1930s, where there was a sharp decline and economic activity remained very low for a long time. And then, of course, the one that has the new letter, I guess, that's popped up is what's called the I, the free fall, or the L, I suppose I should say, the L, free fall. But I'm hoping this is not the end of the world as we know it. I'm hoping that we can come out of this very quickly. But these are just, food. These are food for thought to make us perhaps have a focus for conversation later. So I think this latest news that came out from the latest forecast from the NatWest markets on April the 21st is a fascinating forecast about the future. This shows the trends for US, the Euro area, the UK, Japan, and China. And you'll see that apart from China, you'll see that the V-shaped recovery and then getting back to normality, perhaps by the end of 2021. So a very rapid recovery and normality, perhaps in 20 months time from now. I think what's most interesting, and it is only a forecast from NatWest, is China. China has had a sharp fall, but it has all of the potential to have a sharp recovery. And not only that, China's recovery could be so strong that actually they will go above where we would expect them to be if they hadn't had the crisis. In other words, they go above the line, the 100 line. So you may find this rather surprising, and indeed many others will find surprising. But I think China is going to focus very strongly on making sure their economy grows even more strongly than before. Now, the reason why I put this slide up, it does signify, an ongoing change in the balance of power in terms of relative economic size. China getting stronger and stronger, and I'm sure that gives all of us food for thought. The symmetry of this crisis is rather interesting. You see that the bell-shaped curve at the top shows, it's a symbolic diagram about the health impact in terms of number of cases of coronavirus. And you see where, we go up to a peak and then we decline. It's interesting that the economic impact, of course, is almost a mirror image. So as the number of cases decline, so the economic recovery will take off. It's not difficult to understand that. But of course, we need to stress this. Ending the lockdown is not going to happen suddenly. It's going to be a gradual process. As I say, we're hoping for details in the UK very soon, and I know India will be doing exactly the same thing. But of course, it's not going to be suddenly the doors are open and here we go again. It's going to take many, many months before we get back to any sense of normality. So just coming to a close, in terms of policy responses, you're all aware of this. In your own countries, you'll have seen different things. Right across the globe, a significant government response in every country has been required to just avoid a depression, a critical drop in GDP, which is sustained, a sustained recession. We wait and see if this is going to happen. I'm reasonably optimistic that we're going to avoid a long-term decline. I said many times, I'm hoping for a short, sharp fall and then followed by recovery. But I think that will depend on each country's response. The Economist magazine has just come out with figures where, just to give you a sense of the scale of this, the US and the Eurozone governments, they've already committed $7.4 trillion already. And that is unlikely to be the end of the story. So the scale of government intervention is unprecedented in our history. We have never seen so much money being pumped into our economies by our governments in history. And a number of governments, of course, are also paying workers' wages. We call it in the UK the job retention scheme, whereby workers are furloughed. And the word furlough means leave of absence. So workers retain their jobs, but they're given leave of absence. And in the UK, the government is paying up to 80% of their wages. And that scheme comes to an end in the UK at the end of June. And we wait to see if the government's going to extend this. But the cost, of course, is enormous. It means the government are paying people not to work to avoid their companies going bankrupt. And of course, right around the world, many governments are providing loans to corporates at very low rates and sometimes zero cost of capital, at least for a year or so. And again, there are many examples around the world of bespoke bailouts helping individual sectors from going under. And I'm sure in India, you've got many examples as well of this. So in summary, wow, what is the global outlook? What is the global outlook for all of us? And I'll just put these up at one time. I'll just repeat my point. Predictions are so unpredictable at the moment, are so difficult to be sure of anything. And some of the statistics coming out really are startling, the range. That is a measure of the uncertainty that we're all facing. I think that moving ahead, much is going to depend on the extent to which social distancing is effective after lockdown. We're going to have to continue to perform social distancing of some form after the lockdown ends in each country. And of course, most forecasters I've said are predicting, and you know, I'm on this side of the fence. They're predicting a sharp fall followed by a swift recovery. But, and here's my qualification. This does depend on governments holding their nerve and the success of their policies in helping companies to survive. And there's no doubt about it that government support is absolutely critical. But I think we've also got to think about the long-term implications of this government support in terms of, somebody said it earlier, in terms of government debt and how will we pay this back? The consequence of this recession are going to be with us for the rest of our lives, I would suggest, because of the scale of government borrowing. And at some point, you know, this money is going to have to be funded by somebody and probably for many generations to come. So my last slide is simply to encourage you all to ask questions, and I will now stop the slide share and I will go back here. I hope you found that of some value and give you some food for thought. So I'm here to answer any questions and have a conversation with you. If you want to ask a question, either come off mute and perhaps speak up. I've got a list of questions already here, by the way. It may be difficult to follow them all immediately, but I will now keep quiet and wait for somebody to ask a question.
I think Dr. Ray, I think your mic is off.
Yeah, sorry. Professor
Okay.
Nellis, with the question that you opened the session, that the three questions that I actually, I think that you are the best person to give us the answer. First of all, what would be the government policy? The heavy government borrowing is going on. Actually, yesterday itself, US Treasury, they told that they are planning to borrow $3 trillion. So from the domestic and outside. And another way that Professor Abhijit Banerjee, he told that Keynesian way is the best possible path that the countries must take. So what is your opinion about these two things, about the government? What should be the government's policies?
Let me deal with the second point first, because that's an easier question to address. I think there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the Keynesian approach of spend your way to recession is the only option. I can't imagine any other government doing something different. So spend was a phrase that Keynes coined in the 1930s during the Great Depression. In a crisis, governments must spend. So I accept that. Similarly, with the global financial crisis, we had a lot of spending. Of course, the consequence is it means that governments are going to build up huge amounts of debt. And you actually said something very important. There's both domestic debt and foreign debt. Let's just clarify these 2 points. Domestic debt is in many ways less critical because essentially we're borrowing from ourselves and we're borrowing from future generations. That's what I said earlier. This problem will continue for many generations to come, but at least it's in our control. If we're borrowing from ourselves, then it's up to us as to how we then look after that. The big challenge for many countries, especially emerging markets, is if they are forced or if they decide to borrow internationally in the foreign currency markets and foreign governments and foreign corporates. That's a more difficult situation, because if you borrow from foreign sources, you then got to pay back those loans in those currencies, and that will depend on how well your economy grows. This is a well-known problem which Latin America faced in the 1980s when they borrowed from foreign sources and then struggled to repay, and they ended up with the Latin American debt crisis and what's called the lost decade. I think a number of countries who are forced to borrow internationally will find themselves facing a lost decade unless they have sound economic policies.
Hi Joe, this is Surendu.
Okay, Surendu.
I hope you're doing good. So my question is regarding the political situation at present. The borrowing that you, the external borrowing that you said, there have been two countries being very protective about foreign investments.
Yeah.
We've seen an instance in India recently where they controlled the FDI investments pertaining to one particular investment in one particular bank that came in from a foreign country. And there has been backlashes against few other countries by the so-called superpowers US and European countries.
Yeah.
So do you see any effect economy wise due to this political situation which is arising? Because China has become a world power in manufacturing and in other sectors as well. Slowly they're developing their strength. But this political instability, do you think what effect do you think this will have on economy, world economy?
Yeah, I think you've raised a really important question, and one that is, I think, going to trouble many of us for many years. There is a danger. Let's be very clear about this. There is a danger that this crisis will spark off nationalism, self-interest in many parts of the world. And that causes me to be very, very concerned. I am absolutely against this. I understand the need for some countries to look more inwards at the current time, but I absolutely, passionately believe in a global economy that's supporting each other, not only because of the pandemic, but economically. I'm a great supporter of this, and I fear that countries such as the USA and China, and perhaps the European Union, I hope not, but I fear that they may actually become more protectionist. And it's almost, and the danger, of course, is it may be a quid pro quo. In other words, as one country says, we're going to put a restriction on imports, another country will do the same. You know, for the last 50 years, the living standards of millions of people around the world have been improved because of globalization and international trade and cooperation. I sincerely hope we do not see a reversal of that. So I would welcome, if I were in India, I would welcome inward investment. I would welcome cooperation. I would welcome trade agreements. I would not welcome protectionism. That's my absolutely clear point on this question.
Professor Nellis, there is one thing happened that foreign portfolio investors, they continue to remain net sellers on Tuesday, and they pulled out $139.98 billion from Indian equities during the past few days. So actually, this is happening in other countries also, that portfolio investors are withdrawing the money. So what is your opinion that why it is happening and how to reverse the trend?
No, I think, you know, let's stand back from this and be a little bit less personal. There is an understandable flight caused by panic on the part of many investors. So this is not a great surprise, but I think it's short term. You know, countries such as India, which have done remarkably well in the last 10 years or more, you know, your potential still exists. Your potential for further growth still exists. You still have the education, the talent, the people, the market. So, you know, I wouldn't panic at this reaction. I think it's investors, you know, can equally flood back into countries again. I think it's back to my earlier point. As soon as there is some clarity and some certainty over a vaccine, I think we will see a very different reaction. I think that the main reason why many reacted that way in some countries is maybe uncertainty about some of the measures being taken in countries such as India. Are you confident you can control the pandemic? I don't know. You may know. But as soon as there is confidence that this pandemic is under control, I think you will see investment coming back in again. And I'll make my point once more. And I've made this point not just recently, but for several years. I think the future of the world economy, irrespective of this pandemic, is going to be determined by the success of emerging markets. You know, the more developed economies, the so-called advanced economy. I don't like using those words, but you know, our rate of growth is definitely slowing down because we're old. We're rather inflexible. You have the dynamism, you have the potential to drive the world economy, and all of the forecasters are pretty well consistent on this. So the fruits of the future are with you, and I wouldn't over stress the current short-term behavior of investors and some governments around the world.
So let's hope that our population, huge population of India, is not actually a burden, but it's a boon. Let's see what happens.
I hope so. I sincerely hope so. I've been following India for a long time, and I think your day is here. This pandemic is a shock to all of us, but the potential growth of India remains. That's the point I'm making. You have that potential still. There's no reason to doubt that, in my opinion.
Joe, I have a question.
Yes.
This is about the digital currencies that so China has started the e-renminbi, and there are other countries who are thinking. How do you think it is going to play out in the next few months, years, the digital currency?
You know, this is a question beyond my pay grade. You know, I have never really spent much time thinking about digital currencies or bitcoins or cryptocurrencies. And the reason is, and I may be totally wrong, of course, the reason why I've ignored this topic for so long is that so far, it's been a small fraction of world transactions.
Right.
And therefore, until this becomes a serious topic, and of course, China, you know, could change this whole situation. Until they become significant means of payment and transactions around the world, I think it's a niche topic at the moment. That's just my opinion. I may be totally wrong. I mean, that point, of course, is quite different from the question about cash versus digital payment systems. That's a very different topic. I certainly in the UK, nobody's using cash. Cash is gone at the minute. When I go into a shop, they don't want to take cash. Everybody wants plastic card. So there's no doubt I think there will be a change and an acceleration in the use of digital means of payment. But that's quite a different topic, of course, from bitcoins and cryptocurrencies and so on.
On a related, just to extend it, look, the oil crisis which is going on, or the price which there has been slump, and the way it has affected United States, there are, you know, a lot of people who think that petrodollar could be at crisis.
Well, you know, oil is priced in dollars, and I'm going to be controversial.
Yes.
Very controversial. The US has had the luxury of a global reserve currency for a very long time, since 1947. So if this crisis and the oil crisis, if it stimulates the search for alternative reserve currencies to help countries diversify, I would be very pleased. But that's a controversial comment, because we are dependent on the dollar still, and will be dependent on it for many, many years to come. But it does give the luxury of, it gives the US the luxury of not having to worry about the exchange rate. You know, if you're an American and you earn dollars and you borrow dollars and you pay back in dollars, the value of the dollar means nothing. It's the value to the rest of us that has an impact. And so yeah, there's no doubt there will be some discussion about this, but I think it's not the biggest topic today.
And all of you have some other questions, like several questions are lying in chat. So
Okay.
I had a question. I had a question. First of all, thank you for letting me here. I'm
Go ahead.
Siddhant. So, do you think the special drawing rights, like back in 2009 financial crisis, IMF evoked, that should be allowed for participants?
Absolutely. I mean, the SDRs were created after the Second World War, when the IMF was formed, and they've been a very, very important source of reserve currency, or means of payment, for many developing countries around the world. So I have no doubt that rather than... Sorry, please.
So, but the major drawback of SDR was developing countries, because SDR reserves are based, like it is allocated from the participating shares.
Yes.
So basically, developed countries get more benefits than underdeveloped or developing countries.
Well, you
like
know,
US will take a lot of money from that.
No, I understand, but the point I was going to make, and I was just about to say this, let me give a developing economy a choice. They need to borrow hard currency to buy imports, etc., etc. Would you prefer to be locked into a single foreign currency, i.e. the dollar, or a basket of foreign currencies? The special drawing rights is made up of the members, as you said. And I'm not sure which is absolutely correct, but I think by having an SDR, it creates a pool of funds from the member countries that at least is a collective support for developing economies. And I think this is going to expand, but my main point is being dependent on the dollar alone, I think is more a serious problem for many countries than being dependent on a group of currencies.
Okay, but there is another question from Ms. Hioli that what about the aviation industry? Because several things are talking about the aviation industry. I'm just requesting Ms. Hioli to please continue with your question.
Yes. Yeah, I've seen a couple of those questions, and I see the one about the aviation industry. So, in my opinion, recovery of aviation here could be a year extending beyond the lockdowns. A great question, by the way, and it's been on British television this morning. Virgin Atlantic is going to reduce its workforce by 3,000. BA have said by 12,000. I fear for the aviation industry. Let me say why. It may take a very long time for people to get back to normal, who will want to fly again. And that may take a year or two. But here's another point. As we all get used to Zoom rooms and this form of communication, I wonder what will happen to business travel. Will there be a downturn in business travel? I must say, I'm finding Zoom to be remarkably good at communication. Of course, it's not the same as looking at you eyeball to eyeball, but I think a percentage of business travel will decline as people feel that this is good enough. So aviation is going to have a huge challenge going forward. In contrast, I think the automobile industry, car manufacturing, could well pick up again for a similar reason. Do I want to go on a packed train? You will know what I mean by that, by the way. Especially in India, my son has been there many times. But if you can afford to buy a small car, you may prefer to actually be with your family in that car than on a packed train. So I think there's going to be different sectors will behave differently. But all that I'm hearing, and as I say, it may be wrong, I'm hearing aviation is going to go through fundamental restructuring, and there will be an impact that will be negative for a very long time. There was another question I picked up, by the way, which was a classic Econ 101 question. So let me mention this. Do you think the multiplier effect of Keynesian approach will be less accentuated in this pandemic brought recession? I think the opposite. I think that the multiplier effect is going to be significant post this pandemic. I think governments, for at least the short term, governments, I said it earlier, are going to spend, because they're going to have to spend. And they will not be able to turn off the tap of spending immediately, because then their economies will go back into another decline. So I think we're in the classic, with a small c, the classic Keynesian environment where spending is here now for quite some time. But I make my earlier point. At some time in the future, there will be a slowdown. There will be repayment, and we've got to prepare for that, I think. And that may be some years away. I see here, India needs a stimulus of around 8 to 10% of GDP. How much could a country like India borrow, which is already at 4% fiscal deficit and gross borrowing of 68%? Yeah, I hear that. 4% fiscal deficit and 68% national debt to GDP, I'm jealous. Compared to what we're facing here in the UK and across Europe and in America, 4% is very, very, very low. We're going to be well over 10%, 13, 14% fiscal deficit this year. Our national debt is heading towards 100% of GDP and rising. If you look at Italy, Italy is off the scale. Of course, you are an emerging market, and therefore we have to think of that in that context. My personal view is, regardless of how big these figures are, it's unavoidable. It's unavoidable.
Can I explain the question, Joe?
Of course you can, of course.
Right. So look, the kind of stimulus that we require is about 10%.
I see that.
Yeah. The problem is that our rating is,
Correct.
just a stage above subprime.
Correct.
And so if we sort of, our estimates is that India should stretch it up to about 6% of GDP, the fiscal deficit for this year to meet the gap.
Yeah.
But there's this risk of rating degrade, and then currency effects and those sort of issues.
No, I hear this. I understand that. It's great that you've added those few points to your question. The credit rating agencies are gonna hurt some countries, of course, for the reason you've said. But let's just reflect on this. If India was the only country doing this, I would agree with you 100%. The whole world is doing this. And therefore, in relative terms, I'm not as sure as you may be that the rating agencies will downgrade your situation as much as you think. In other words, we're all in it together. Now, I could be totally wrong.
No, that was my thought. But the chief economic advisor of India, he has a different line of thinking. In that sense.
And I respect that, and I think we need alternative views to reach some sensible outcomes. It simply is worth considering his point. It doesn't mean it is correct. My point, it doesn't mean that I'm correct, but we have to consider all the factors and stand back from this. I still go back to my earlier point. As I said, I've been looking at India for quite some time, and I think the prospects are really very positive. I suspect in the next 20, 30 years, you're going to be, well, you are already a huge economy, but you'll be even greater. And I think in terms of rank order, you will be in the top 3 or 4 countries in the world. So I'm an optimist at all times, despite my negative thoughts about the virus and the economic downturn that's with us. So I think, be positive. Economic advisors, they are right to be cautious. I would not want them to be reckless. But at the same time, governments have to then make realistic decisions about this.
Joe, hi. I have a question related to the oil and gas industry.
Yeah.
Now, there are a couple of big industries in the world which have always kind of been in the forefront, like oil and gas, like IT, e-commerce. Now, oil and gas has taken a major hit. I mean, COVID is one of the things, but it hasn't been so hunky-dory in the recent past as well. I mean, with all the the oil price war between Russia and Saudi and the Iran, issues. So there has been issues with the overproduction. There has been issues with how to get the price up. And on the top of that, this COVID has literally killed the market. I mean, so how do you see this sector, emerging in terms of the exploration, in terms of the refining, the fuels, and even in the petrochemical side?
A difficult question. As I say, it's difficult to predict the future at the moment. But if economic recovery, as forecast by the IMF and some other organizations, if economic recovery is as quick as they expect next year, then of course we would expect to see oil prices rise again sharply. Now, I'm not a gambler, and I'm not licensed to give advice, but clearly, as you said, oil prices are falling for some time, long before the COVID crisis. And that was more about a gradual slowdown in the major economies, a slowdown to perhaps a more sustainable long-term growth rate. But no question, it will bounce back to some degree next year. But I have one other point to make, and again, you may find this controversial. Perhaps we have to start. Maybe this crisis will start preparing us for life after oil sooner than we expected. Given the environmental damage that fossil fuels have done. And so perhaps this is, in some ways, is a good thing. Now, if you're in the oil industry, you certainly won't want to hear that. But, let's hope this accelerates the movement towards, more sustainable growth in renewable resources, et cetera, et cetera. Folks, I see a lot of other questions coming in, and I just see one here that, if you'll allow me to pick this up, It says, how do I think the UK and other countries will pay for high fiscal debt? Do you think a number of taxes will go up? Now, that's obviously a question that interests me greatly because it mentions the UK, but it should affect all of us. Gosh, this is a game changer. I think the scale of debt accumulation, not just government debt, by the way, but also personal debt, is a game changer. I'm almost reluctant to say this, but I think all governments around the world, certainly I think in the UK, are going to be searching very hard after this crisis for sources of revenue, perhaps in places that they didn't look before. One of my personal fears is that in a country like the UK, the biggest holders of, I'll say wealth with a small w. I don't mean the super rich. I mean the people with savings, of course, generally are the older generation. They've got savings, they've got assets, they've got property, they have little debt. I just fear personally that the government will approach that group much more to tax their savings, to tax their assets. As I say, that frightens me. But if I was in government, do I have much choice here? I'm not sure I do. At the same time, I absolutely hope, I really do, and this is irrespective of the crisis, I hope all governments work harder to make corporates and wealth holders pay the taxes they should be paying. And I'm not trying to preach a message here, but I think, this is not just about the crises. I think, paying tax is a responsibility for all of us. And you know what I'm referring to. How many companies, how many individuals avoid paying tax through tax loopholes, etc. I think society recognizes that this is not sustainable, particularly because, and all of the evidence so far suggests this, the groups in society who will be hardest hit by this crisis will be the poorest people in society, the ones at the base of the pyramid. And I think that cannot be right. So, as I said, I'm an optimist, and I'm hoping that out of this crisis, that there will be some rethink on the part of all of us about fairer taxation and the willingness to pay taxes. That may not sound good to all of you here, but I think it's essential.
Thank you, Professor.
Another question from our faculty, Pompa Sorkar. Do you think that this impact of crisis on real economy will be stronger than on financial sector?
Interesting. I mean, of course, the global financial crisis, the impact was on the financial sector primarily, and yet this time round, very few people are talking about the impact on the financial crisis. So I think the answer to your question is clear. I think the impact will be on the real economy, not on the financial sector. I think governments have now learned how to bail out banks quick enough, and that hasn't happened this time. It hasn't been necessary. I think the real economies are the issue here. And I think that's where we come back to my earlier point. I think some sectors are going to bounce back very quickly. Some sectors are not. I hear words like a marathon recovery. What that means is for some sectors that are going down, it will take a long time before they recover. It's a marathon, not a sprint, not a V shape. And therefore, and sadly, I think there are some companies that will not recover. Some sectors will change permanently, and it's terrible for many workers. I think many jobs will be lost, which will not come back. But the winners are going to be those who are the most resilient, the most flexible, the most adaptable. But for some, it will not be possible. So I agree with the point being raised. The question is, will it be the real economy that will be affected most? I think so, yes, indeed.
Sorry?
So I have his one today.
Oh.
Yeah, I said he's must be coming up.
Somebody please turn your microphones off. We're hearing your conversation with somebody else.
Anybody has any other questions
Joe, so another one, and this is about, what should a country like India do to enhance its competitiveness post-pandemic, in the post-pandemic era?
You know, I'll give you the same. I'll give you the same answer that I've given for the last decade or more, because I teach a lot of Indian students here at Cranfield, and I'm asked this question frequently. You know, it's the classic question about how do you create sustainable growth, and for me, the answer is always the same: education, education, education. Unless you have the pool of talent, the skills that can adapt to change, then it's very difficult to grow. But I know, and you know, India is doing this on an incredible scale. And, you know, I actually celebrate this across the world. Education is without doubt one of the booming sectors in the global economy, and has been for the last 10, 20, 30 years. But it really is picking up pace now. And, you know, ironically, this crisis, I think, is going to accelerate that because of, well, Zoom, for example. I think that the reach of education is expanding. And every university that I know, they're all now not just on Zoom temporarily, but they're now looking for longer term strategies to use online learning much more. And that's going to expand the reach of education. So the answer to your question for me is very straightforward. Continue to invest in your talent pool, continue to invest in education, bring up the base of the pyramid, which you are doing anyway. And it will take a long time, but it is working. The same happened in China, and I think that will continue everywhere else as well. So that's a very simple answer, but I think it's the most, for me, the most important point, the most important response to your question. Folks, I'm conscious it's almost coming up to an hour, and I could happily stay here all day. I do have more and more Zooms coming up, as you can imagine.
Professor Nellis, I have one question that at one side, all of us are agreeing that the government will have to increase tax. At the other end, every sector of the economy, especially the industrial sector, they are talking about the stimulus package from the government and a lot of tax holidays and lots of these things. So these two things are actually contradicting when the deficit financing problem comes in front of the government, whether to increase tax. And if the tax is increased, then what will happen to the effective demand? Because if we have to work in the Keynesian path, then effective demand would have to be increased. So, sir, Professor, how to balance these two things?
Yeah, but of course, this is the classic dilemma facing all governments around the world. This is not unique to India. Look, I understand there is the view of corporates and the view of government. And you cannot square the circle. It's impossible. So it's up for governments to manage, to make decisions. My point was not exactly the same point you're making. I was also suggesting that there's areas of income, areas of wealth, areas of assets that can be taxed, which may be lying idle. For example, if you've got a billionaire, how much money can that person spend? So that's a controversial point, but how much can they spend in their lifetime? So we're going to have to change our view about taxation. But equally, the support for industry is essential, but it cannot continue indefinitely. And at some point in the future, there has to be a realignment and therefore increased taxation. But for all of us, the only question is who's going to pay more than others? This is an ethical question in many ways, but the economic aspect is clearly daunting for every single country. But we're all in together. Shall I take one last question? I saw there was a hand up again from Sanjeeva, but is there a last question?
One question is there also, sir, from my side. Can I ask?
You can ask, of course, Pampa.
Yeah, sir, I just want to know which area in economy do you think require the most attention and innovation post-COVID-19? What do you think? That's what
gosh, the most. Well, actually, you know, there's a simple answer, and I just realized that it's so relevant to India. I didn't appreciate it when you asked the question. In every economy, the sector that drives the economy most is actually the SME sector, small and medium-sized enterprises. The big corporates, the global corporates, you know, they will restructure, they will adjust, etc. But you know this in India better than I do, that the small and medium-sized enterprises, they represent the vast proportion of economic activity. So I think that's where I would target probably most support, maintain jobs at that level because they have the dynamism, they've got the creativity, they've got the entrepreneurialism that will actually shape the future. So, you know, I didn't think of this question. I didn't see it coming, but for me, that would be the most important sector to look after. And folks, as I say, it's just coming up to 11 o'clock and I have another Zoom coming. But can I just say, first of all, thank you for inviting me to address you. I'm absolutely certain that you will not agree with everything I've said. I didn't expect it, and I don't look for that. I think all of us are in this together, and therefore we need to keep on sharing views and ideas and to help us understand what the future looks like. I'm happy to return, by the way, at any time when you wish. But I hope you find this of some use. I hope, and I certainly enjoyed meeting you, and I apologize for having to go, but it's an incredibly busy day today. Thank you so much indeed.
Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you all of you to be here. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Dr. Ed. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Neil.
Bye.
I see you, Neil.
Oh,
I see all my
Joe,
friends there, by the way. Hi, Martin.
Okay. Okay, Joe, just one request to you.
Yes.
If you have recorded the session, can you send it to me? Because
I didn't record it because you were the original host.
Okay.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Oh.